Welcome back to News Talk here on News Channel 8. Joining us now here on the program, D.C. Councilman Kenyon McDuffie, a Democrat. He represents Ward 5, and he chairs the Council's Committee on the Judiciary. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. Thanks for your time. You just held a town hall meeting on crime in the district. We all know that the city's been experiencing, other cities too, experiencing a surge in the past few months. What did you get from that meeting? What did you hear from the folks who attended? Unless I'm mistaken, that gathering went till late into the night, early into the morning, really.
Yeah, early into the morning, and we had nearly 70 witnesses who came down to the Wilson building to testify. And importantly, Bruce, what we got, I think what we concluded, was that people were focused on solutions. And that's what the hearing was all about. We wanted to know from the public, as well as from government officials, what we needed to do to address the spike in crime that we've seen. And so, importantly, we had some really great ideas and suggestions that were made.
What were the prime takeaways? What kind of wisdom did you get?
Well, one of the things I mentioned on your show the last time I was on is that we needed to move towards a public health approach to addressing violence in the District of Columbia, and we heard a number of witnesses who actually testified to that. They mentioned some of the models that have been utilized in other jurisdictions around the country that have had proven positive results. And so we heard testimony about the Cure Violence model. We heard testimony about the Richmond model out of Richmond, California. We heard about things that are happening in Boston and Chicago. And we heard that residents want to see some of these innovative strategies implemented sooner rather than later.
Is despair at the root of all this? A sense that people may not have the skills, or they don't perceive that they have the skills for the jobs that are available. There's so much grinding them down on a day-to-day basis. Is that where does that fall into the whole?
It's a very important part of it. There in some communities, unfortunately, exists a culture of violence. There are cycles of despair and hopelessness that are passed on from generation to generation. People who experience high crime on a daily basis, who have the highest rates of unemployment, drop out from high school. I mean, all types of things that are affecting these communities that we need to target. And so it is going into those communities, using the resources that exist in some of these communities, the credible messengers who understand what these communities are experiencing, and partnering with government to get at the root causes of some of the crime that we're seeing. And we heard people talk about that at the hearing a couple of weeks ago.
Is that what undergirds some of these approaches that you referenced a moment ago?
Absolutely. When you talk about people being exposed to violence and the trauma associated with violence that they experience at a very early age, it's one thing to really focus on law enforcement and the response to a crime after it happens. What I'm proposing and what my colleagues are supporting is an approach that focuses on prevention and intervention. And so we want to support law enforcement and the need to make sure that we police and that if somebody commits a violent crime, they're prosecuted swiftly. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we can focus on going into these communities where people are at the highest risk of being victims of crime or committing crimes, and focusing on prevention and intervention.
Phone lines open as we talk today with D.C. Councilman Kenyon McDuffie, Democrat from Ward 5, Chairman of the Council's Committee on the Judiciary. We have phone lines open for those of you watching in the 11 o'clock hour. If you would like to participate in the discussion, we would love to have you do so. Those of you watching in the 11 o'clock hour, that's when we can take calls. So dial in at 703-387-1020. That's the number we've posted to the bottom of the screen. Dial now. It increases the chances we'll be able to include you in the discussion today. Again, 703-387-1020, our number. We'll go to the phones as calls come in. Can you describe the legislation you've introduced?
Sure, absolutely. So I introduced a bill just last week that would create an Office of Neighborhood Engagement. We're calling the bill the Neighborhood Engagement and Achieve Results Act of 2015. And so one of the most important things it's going to do is create an Office of Neighborhood Engagement and Safety. And it really is based off the Richmond, California model that has received some success out in that area that focuses on young adults and really those adults who are at the highest risk of either being victims of violent crimes or committing violent crimes, and trying to bring them in through incentives, financial incentives, and putting them on a pathway to success. And we've looked at this model and some of the successes it's achieved out in California. We want to replicate that here in the District of Columbia. One of the other things that the proposal would do, importantly, would create an Office of Violence Prevention. It is important that we involve our health-related agencies, our workforce development agencies, our other agencies that go beyond law enforcement and make them a part of the solution. And having a health approach is going to be critically important. And so creating that Office of Violence Prevention, they would be charged with creating that strategy in the District of Columbia for a health approach. We do several other things that are part of this legislation. One of it is collecting more data and analyzing that more routinely so we can fill in some of the gaps that we're seeing in our system. And it also would give the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice direct grant authority on a limited basis to be able to reach those communities and those organizations and individuals who are in the trenches, who are really already in these communities, who understand the problems that they're going on, and partnering with them to address some of these issues.
In talking with commanders or possibly the chief, do you have any sense that the last couple weeks have been better than the period prior to that? Or is it a continuation of what we saw and experienced in the summer and maybe spring?
Well, as of yesterday, we're at 120 homicides, and so we're up over 50% this year where we were in 2014. And so we're still seeing the homicides occur, the violence is still occurring in the city. And so it's important to make sure that we aren't doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It is critically important. I think that was one of the themes that we heard in the hearing that I held on the homicides and violence, is that people want to take a new, innovative approach. We know some of the issues that underlie the violence that we're seeing: lack of educational opportunities, lack of employment opportunities, not having the access to affordable housing and health care and other things. And so we want to incorporate that into our overall public safety strategy in the District of Columbia.
Chaplain Johnson is on line one and has a comment or perhaps question for you, Councilman McDuffie. So we pick up on line one. Chaplain, welcome, and go right ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hello, I'm Chaplain Johnson. We have approximately 100 college students from George Washington University, Catholic University, University of Maryland, that are involved in intervention and prevention with kids. And I want to know specifically, Councilman, how could we be much more engaged in intervention and prevention?
The intervention and prevention piece of it. Thank you very much.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you for the question, Chaplain Johnson. And one of the things that I've been working with our area universities and other organizations, including some of the nonprofits, they've already done research on some of these models that have been implemented across the country. And so talking about intervention and prevention, one of the things that the bill would do in terms of the health approach would be to embed social workers in hospitals around the city to try to address some of these victims when they come into the hospital facilities and provide them types of counseling and mediation that they need at a very early point in which we want to address some of these things before it turns into retaliation, before it turns into violence. And so that is the type of prevention and intervention that we're talking about. And so it is the partnership with law enforcement where they are responding to crimes after they happen, but we're working with the Department of Behavioral Health, we're working with the Department of Health to make sure that we're addressing the exposure to violence when it happens, and when these youth, in many cases, and adults as well, are actually going into the hospitals around the city.
I have more questions for you on this, and we'll get to them probably in our second segment. I want to ask you right now, if I could, about the fire chief's the steps that the fire chief has taken to deal with the ambulance shortage. There's been such a surge in calls for shortage that at times there aren't enough ambulances to provide people with all the care that they need at the moment that they need it most. Private ambulance service, we are told, is part of the solution, or is the primary piece of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely, and this is a very important issue that we're dealing with, and I think most of your viewers know it. You talk about a surge in calls. Just last month we had 18,000 calls for emergency services in the District of Columbia. And in talking with Chief Dean and hearing his proposal, which I think is a really solid step in the right direction, his goal is to try to keep the units that we have in the city in service so we continually respond, particularly to the most serious calls that we're getting. And so the idea is to bring in a third-party contractor to handle some of the most basic medical calls that we get in the District of Columbia. And so if somebody calls 911, you're going to have somebody from Fire and EMS, one of the call takers, once it's dispatched, decide whether or not the call is a very serious call and requires the very serious attention, or whether or not it's just a basic medical attention that's needed. And if that is the case, then the third-party contractor would come in with their unit to pick up that individual. And so we don't tie down all our ALS units with the basic calls that we're getting.
Councilman McDuffie, stand by for just a moment, if you would. Please, we'll continue our conversation here on News Talk with D.C. Councilman Kenyon McDuffie straight ahead. More of your phone calls, too, right after we pause to get you caught up on the hour's top stories and the forecast. And, of course, for those of you watching After Dark, the second half hour of the program can be found online at news8newstalk.com.